We're live. Minister, it is a distinct pleasure to welcome you here to Hudson today. It's Dr. Gintarė Skaistė, close, who serves as Lithuania's Minister of Finance. Gintarė holds a number of distinctions, and I think you're going to find her remarks here today very, very useful. She was named last year by a Financial Times publication as the Finance Minister of the Year, together with a few others. And she has, of course, presided in one of the most critical jobs that a country can have during a time of enormous turbulence with back-to-back plagues, first COVID, then the Russians. And in both cases, the shock to the Lithuanian economy has been severe. There have been enormous inflationary pressures, as we've had here, skyrocketing energy costs, which, as we all know, translates very quickly into increased food prices and other commodities. These are all things that finance ministers grapple with. And she's done this in Lithuania while at the same time carving out enough financial breathing room to allow Lithuania to become the third largest NATO ally in terms of GDP expenditure on defense at nearly 2.5%, and I believe set to increase. And that's not a small accomplishment when you also consider that she's been at the forefront of supporting Ukraine against Russian invaders. In terms of total aid commitments to Ukraine, also as a percentage of GDP, Lithuania ranks third in the world. Numbers kind of vary, but the latest numbers I've seen are 1.3% of GDP that has actually gone directly to the Ukrainians. We should do well to remember that as we listen to certain pundits and politicians here in Washington moaning about the price to the United States of supporting the Ukrainians, when as a percentage of our GDP, what we have so far provided is roughly half of what Lithuania has been able to afford. When you read the minister's very modest biography that the embassy gave me, one of the things that you might actually miss or skip over is the fact that she's also a member of the Lithuanian Riflemen's Union. And in fact, you were born in Kaunas, which is where the Territorial Self-Defense Force of Lithuania was founded in 1919. And then, of course, became the basis of the guerrilla movement in Lithuania, first against the Soviets, then against the Nazis, then against the Soviets again. I'd had the opportunity to visit Vilnius a few weeks ago and had the chance to actually go to the Museum of Occupation, which is headquartered, or the museum is actually situated in the old KGB headquarters in downtown Vilnius. And it takes you about 5 minutes in that museum to realize that what the Russians are doing today to Ukraine, stealing children, deporting people, filtration camps, mass graves, summary executions, torture, targeting of civilians, these are all things that they did 70 years ago to Lithuania and to the other Baltic countries. You spend another 5 minutes in that museum and you realize that the Riflemen's Union and the will of the Lithuanian people to resist is enormously strong. They are a strong ally, they're a great partner, and you have to date been a fantastic finance minister. And so we are very interested in hearing your views on the current situation at home and the challenges we face with regard to Russia's atrocities against the Ukrainian people. Minister, please.
Actually, when we're talking about Rifleman Union, that's I have to mention one small message also that I found recently, that not only I am the member of Rifleman Union, but my grandmother was a member of Rifleman Union in the same Kaunas city, and I found it really recently. And she belonged to the small group in Rifleman Union that also belonged to the Ministry of Finance. That was pretty tricky new foundings, but I think that gives us a sense of time. And the same was happening several decades ago, and the same is happening now in Ukraine. And we have to be prepared because you never know what will happen to your country, and you have to always stand in the right side of the history because you never know if it will touch your family, your nation, your country. So you have to stand together with those countries who are fighting in the right side of the history. And standing here today, I think that the main topic where I can help as a Minister of Finance is in a fighting with an enemy is maybe economic field. And in economic field, there are several ways. Helping Ukraine, giving funding to Lithuanian military, and the other battlefield is sanctions. And I think it's really important to discuss about sanctions that are imposed on Russia and Belarus because they are affecting their economy, they are lowering their ability to fight in the battlefield and to enforce their army in the upcoming years. So it's really important to understand why they are imposed, are they working, how they are working, and how we can improve the enforcement of the sanctions at the same time. And when we are talking about effect of the sanctions, there's always a question, is it what we expected when we created the sanctions regime? Now we see that the effect of sanctions on Russia's economy is that in the year of 2022, the GDP of Russia decreased by 2.1% of GDP. Is it much? Not so much. I think we expected more. But always when we talk about our enemies, you have to understand that not only you are very clever, your enemies are preparing for their actions, and Russians had one advantage. They knew that they will attack Ukraine, and they were preparing for that. And if you see the energy market half of the year before the invasion to Ukraine, the gas that Russia gives to Europe decreased sharply, and the price of gas increased also sharply. I think with all these decisions, Russia was preparing to the fight, to the war, because they were increasing the dependence of European Union countries on Russia, on Russia's fossil fuels, and the price increased already before the war, because I remember the autumn of the year before the invasion, we already, as a country, prepared the first package of energy support package to our society. And that was the beginning. And then the Russians already knew that they will attack Ukraine. They created the Sovereignty Welfare Fund. All the funds were going to that Sovereignty Fund. They have fiscal buffers to feel free quite well in the current situation. So they were preparing, and we must understand that if we are fighting, we have to fight with an enemy that is well informed and well prepared. And also we must understand that the consequences of these decisions, that Russia intervened into the energy market, was that the surplus of the international trade last year in Russia was quite big. It was 316 billion. And that led the Russia to increase the spending to the infrastructure projects, to increase the spending to military war-related products creation, and that kept their economy alive. And that's how they are working. But at the same time, we must understand that sanctions are working. And if sometimes somebody says that sanctions are hurting yourselves, but they're not hurting Russia, that's not true. What's hurting our economies? It's hurting Russia's decisions to intervene into energy market, to lower the gas supply to the European Union market, and that's what affecting our economies. Sanctions are hurting Russia, not us. And we see now that the revenues after having a price cap for oil, we see that Russia's revenues are falling, and first months of this year was already not so optimistic for Russians as they expected. And also the revenues are falling not only for oil and gas, but also for the other sectors that are not oil and gas. And we see it from the data that we have already today. Also, the sanctions are affecting other sectors that are dependent on imports. For example, automotive industry that is affected by 2/3 of production that is really are done by 1 year. And also the G7 oil price cap is giving also fiscal pressures on Russia because the revenues are decreasing this year. And first months show that the budget deficit is quite big. And that gives like a choice for Russia or to use the sovereign welfare fund or to borrow. That's costly. And the sovereign welfare fund is not unlimited itself, so you have to choose, and those choices are not very easy. And also we must understand that sanctions is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So you have to keep on fighting, and you have to understand that some impacts will come later and not so fast as we would like to. So how we can improve the sanctions regime? So I think there are 2 tracks. So new sanctions, broadening the scope of the sanctions that are now, or improving compliance, because sometimes compliance is really a problem also. Looking at what hurts Russia's revenues, I think that the most important target anyway, it's oil and gas, because it's a main good that Russia possesses. And we have calculations that decrease by $1 for barrel for oil, decreases Russia's revenues by 2.7 billion annual export earnings. That's quite a lot. So we must understand that the impact precisely on gas and oil is really effective, and it gives the impact. And also, as we see that Russia is also not stupid, they're changing their taxation system on the oil because with the price cap, they have seen that their revenues are falling. They're changing the taxing system. So we must also be creative, and we must find another decisions that will affect their ability to sell oil at a higher price. And also we must improve enforcement. I think it's really important because also they're finding another ways to sell oil upper the cap. They're buying some ships to sell their oil, and we must understand, but it's a constant fight, and you must be creative to follow what they are doing. And also we are advocating for broadening the scope of the sanctions, because there are some loopholes anyway left, and especially in the field of finance, because the 3rd biggest bank in Russia is still not sanctioned. And as we see, previously it was left like a possibility to pay for gas for Europeans and for the other countries. But as Europe is deciding not to buy Russian gas and oil anymore, and we have huge investment dedicated to that. So I think that those loopholes that were left previously are not needed anymore. Those exemptions that were made for gas and oil payments are not needed anymore. So I think we should cut that and go blindly and strictly to impose the sanctions on that goods. And also we are seeing that Russia is avoiding the sanctions through 3rd countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and other countries that are neighboring Russia. We are seeing the increasing numbers of goods that are sanctioned, that cannot go to Russia directly. They are coming through different countries, and I think we must employ all the weapons we have in the pockets to do that. They cannot use this loophole anymore. And also we are, as a neighbor country with Belarus, understand that Belarus is like a accomplice of Russia in our opinion. Russian troops invaded Ukraine from the side of Belarus. They came from Belarusian territory, from Belarusian soil. Also, we have heard recently that Russian nuclear weapons will be deployed in Belarus. So we must understand that Belarus is like a little brother of Russia, and we must impose the same sanctions as we have on Russia to Belarus, because Russians are avoiding the sanctions through Belarus, and I think it's really important to close that loophole. And at the same time, we had recently the assessment of the World Bank about the damages that were done in Ukraine, and how much money will we need in upcoming years to recreate everything what was destroyed in Ukraine. And it's huge numbers. The total amount that will be needed for reconstruction is $411 billion. That's a huge amount, and there is always a question: who should pay? Who should pay? We should pay, or Russia should pay? And we think that aggressor must pay. If the countries, the democratic countries as European Union, Japan, Canada, United States, and other countries have inside their countries Russian frozen assets, I think it's really would be right decision to use those Russian frozen assets to reconstruction of Ukraine, because it's like a reparations of the war. If they had done damage, the atrocities in Ukraine are enormous. They have to pay for what they have done, and we must take frozen assets and to use them for reconstruction of Ukraine in upcoming years. There's legal questions, always there are legal questions, but we have to be creative and to find the way to do something what was really right. And the last question, what Lithuania is doing differently maybe and doing more than the other countries. So we always try to lead by example, because if you ask something to do from other countries, you have to do it yourself at first. So Lithuania was the first country to say goodbye to Russian fossil fuels. We're not buying Russian gas, not Russian electricity, nor Russian oil. And that was done already in the spring of the last year. Now we, when we're talking about the sanctions, we created some new instruments, because previously we really saw that we are lacking the instruments that would be helpful in this current situation, because everything what's related to sanctions are really new, and we didn't knew how to implement the sanctions, how to punish the people who are avoiding the sanctions. So we created a new law, and this is already in a parliament of Lithuania. And now we have the possibility to forfeit assets that is subject of violation of international sanctions, and it's something really new. And also we're increasing the fines to the legal entities and also to the people who are avoiding the sanctions, who are helping to avoid the sanctions. And also we created the basis for national sanctions, because if we see some loopholes, we can cover it by our national decisions. And our goal itself is to make violation of international sanctions really very risky and very costly business, because anyway, it's a business. It's economically reasonable for somebody, but our way of acting is to make it not really so attractive anymore. And if to answer the last question, maybe why other democratic countries which are not neighboring Ukraine directly as all countries in our region should help us and to fight and to implement the sanctions together. I think we must understand that Ukraine is not only Ukraine. We are fighting for democracy, for our values, for some right world that I would like to live in. And if we will let the evil to win, when Ukraine as a country asked to be the part of a democratic society, they wanted to be part of the European Union, they want to say goodbye to the autocratic regimes, and they want to just be a democratic country like us. And if we will not help the countries like Ukraine, we will just let the evil win, and you never know where the evil will stop. And I think always we should stand in the right side of the history. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. My name's Nate Sibley. I am a research fellow here at Hudson Institute, working alongside Marshall, run something called the Kleptocracy Initiative, and I've long been involved with and been a supporter of Lithuania, because when we talk about Russian kleptocracy, they probably the first in Europe to blow the alarm bell on that sort of thing. Even prosecuted a former president, I think, for being involved in that in things he shouldn't have been involved with. So It's a real privilege and honor to be able to talk to you today. Thank you, Marshall, for the great introduction. And thank you for such fascinating and rousing remarks. There's a lot to unpack. But I guess I might sort of start at the opposite end of it, which is what Lithuania thinks the ultimate objective of sanctions should be. We know why we should support Ukraine. You talked about that at the end. But in practical terms, what would it take for Lithuania to think, maybe now's the time to start talking about lifting sanctions? Would it be the complete removal of Russian forces from Ukraine? Would it be the removal of Vladimir Putin from power? Or is it too early simply to start talking about those things, and the right thing to do is just keep the sanctions on as long as Ukraine needs it?
I think there are several goals. One of them is maybe to give Ukrainian time, just because if Russia will have no revenue as much as they would like to, they cannot enforce their army. The second goal, if you're not letting some goods that are needed for their military industry today into the country, they cannot fix their weaponry, they cannot create another weapons, and that gives Ukrainian time. And also the other possibility is that if you're decreasing the revenues in a longer period of time, that will give maybe the opportunity for Russian people to think about, is it really worthwhile to fight, and is it really our war? And the last one, maybe we can use it as a leverage, because if Russia wants their frozen assets to have it again, maybe you should go home with your army and to leave Ukrainian territory.
As I mentioned, Lithuania has this long history of guarding against Russian attempts to influence in a way that you and your Baltic neighbors. At the end of the Cold War, you knew it wasn't really the end of the Cold War. The Russians are still there. They were still trying to interfere in your politics. Do you think that has made the Lithuanian people, they were more ready than some of the other countries to take these difficult measures? Because there has been a negative effect on Lithuania's economy. And are you having the same kind of conversations internally that we're having here in the United States? Why are we sanctioning a big country like Russia, when it hurts us economically, although it doesn't hurt us anywhere near as badly? Why are we sending all this money to Ukraine to help them? Are you having? Is there any sign of those sorts of conversations within Lithuania, or has your long sort of history of knowing what Russia is and about its revanchist ambitions, do you think made you more prepared to take these steps than some other European neighbors?
Firstly, I think we must create the understanding that not sanctions are hurting us. The impact of Russia's decision on the energy market was tremendous, and the prices increased not because of the sanctions. Sanctions were imposed much later. The prices in the energy market increased sharply due to Russia's decisions to lower the supply to European Union. And if you understand what's the reason of your suffering, maybe it would be easier to understand the sanctions are helping you to fight their decisions, that not sanctions that are hurting you. It was Russia's economic war, and they're using energy as a weapon. So we have to take our weapons and to fight this economic war if we don't want to lose it. So from that side, yes. But talking about Lithuanian preparedness, yes, I think we understand that sometimes you have to invest a bit if you want to win a bigger goal. So democracy is not something that it is given for free. You have to fight for it, you have to invest in it. And if we will have safe neighborhood, if we will have safe continent with democratic values, it will be beneficial for everybody. We don't want to have, for example, Belarus near us. Mm-hmm. Belarus is a not democratic regime. And now we have different problems with Belarus. For example, they're just bringing the people from Middle East by planes and forcing them to pass the border with Lithuania, but with the guns in sometimes. So you're just seeing that having the neighbor which is not predictable, who is not democratic, it's a problem. So if you wanted to create the safe environment, the environment in the world that you would like to live in, you have to invest.
How do you see the sanctions, the EU sanctions regime evolving over the next year or so? I think we get a lot, and the media tends to focus on countries like Hungary, sometimes France, whoever, or Germany. They don't want things to become harder for Russia, almost. Yeah, they don't want to strengthen sanctions, and I think the media tends to focus. But there is also a group of European countries who want much stronger sanctions, and I think Lithuania definitely falls into that latter category. Could you talk about some of the other areas that you're having discussions with EU partners about? You talked about the oil and gas industries. Any more information you give us on that? But also perhaps I know like the nuclear exports has also been under discussion. So how do you see it sort of evolving over the next year or so?
We're always advocating for harder sanctions because I think it works, and if we're pushing hard enough, Russia will have to understand that it costs.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, sanctions are working only when we understand each other and agree upon something. If Lithuania imposes the sanctions on Russian oil, nobody cares.
Mm-hmm.
But if sanctions are employed with all the countries together, that's something. So I see the value in finding some common decisions that are really important. And if something's really more painful for one country, you must understand that you must find other decisions that would be comfortable for all of us. So, but situation is also changing because previously energy market was really very dependent on Russia. Now we see that Europe is also investing. So the situation is changing, and sometimes the decisions that were really difficult previously are not so difficult anymore. So we must understand that we must keep looking at all the decisions and maybe change them if there is a space for that.
You talked a bit about a new law to help improve enforcement of sanctions, which is just so important. The first year there's a rush to kind of get everyone aligned on both sides of the Atlantic on introducing sanctions, but without enforcement, sanctions is just a piece of paper. So can you tell us a bit more about this new law, and also whether other countries in the EU are looking to learn from you in terms of the measures you've taken to help strengthen enforcement?
As it is very new, we're just learning by doing,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody learns from each other. And I think this year will definitely be about enforcement of the sanctions, because we have made major decisions, but as I said, enemy is also not sleeping. They're finding their own ways how to avoid the sanctions. So in the implementation and enforcement really will be an issue. And in a 10th package of sanctions in Europe, we also had decisions, for example, about they have to, all the countries that are in Europe, they have to declare about the Russian frozen assets, for example,
Mm-hmm.
that they have in their own country. Previously, we didn't have that decision, and we still don't know where exactly the Russian frozen assets is. So I think after all those decisions, for example, in the middle of May, we will know where in Europe, at least, there are Russian frozen assets. So after when you get the information, the decisions are easier because you just having the right information. So also we have the sanctions envoy in Europe. So implementation is really an issue, and we're learning from each other. Lithuania has done their homework. Maybe other countries can take our example and implement something similar to in their own countries.
One of the things that helps with sanctions enforcement is financial transparency. And over the past sort of decade or so, with the anti-money laundering directives, the EU has sought to improve, including Lithuania, has sought to improve financial transparency, who owns what, shell companies, all the rest of it. That there were things already underway to help strengthen that even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For example, the introduction of a single EU anti-money laundering regulator. And I understand Lithuania is bidding to be the home of that, so please feel free to make a plug. Not that we endorse any particular candidates here at Hudson Institute. But do you see these financial transparency things as important for sanctions enforcement as well?
The decision to have our AML single regulator it was done much previous.
Mm-hmm.
the sanctions, but I think it will help, definitely will help to implement the sanctions. We have seen that the world is big, so always there are people who want to get money from not very nice actions. So anti-money laundering is really important question, and we are putting a lot of emphasis on that, and it's a big priority for Lithuanian government because we think that transparency works and it helps us even to get bigger revenues to our budget, because if you do not let the people to avoid the tax payment, you just have the better situation for yourself. So it really works, and we're standing firmly to implement all the decisions that will be in European Union. They're not very fast, I agree, and if it would be my will, I would say that implementation of that ML regulation would already be in force. Now we have decisions to make it through the process, and some decisions will go into force from 2025. So it will help, but the decisions are not very fast. And yes, Lithuania wants to be a host home for ML agency for Europe, and I think it would be a great example.
No, agreed. Before I just, I've been sort of hogging you. I've got one more question, then I'll sort of go to the audience, if that's all right. Not so much just on sanctions, but President Macron visited France, visited China last week, and made this statement about, the US shouldn't count on the EU always to follow it. They don't want to be always a follower, in line with his long-standing kind of sort of vision for what he calls strategic autonomy for Europe. What is Lithuania's, he's made his views very clear about which direction he wants Europe to go in. What is Lithuania's sort of approach to this issue of the future of the European sort of security architecture? What are your sort of views on that?
I don't know if he was very clear, because everybody was asking him again if they understood him correctly. But I think that Lithuania always stands in the side that democratic countries should act together, and we must not commit the same mistake with China that we made with Russia. And democratic countries, I think we should stand together and defend the democratic values, and also to defend the right of democratic societies to live like they want to. And that's our point of view.
Well, on that note, does anyone have any questions? Just put your hand up. And I'd just like you to say your name and the relevant sort of affiliation or organization you're with. And then, ask a question or a quick comment. Sir?
Thank you very much, Minister. David Magradze from International Republican Institute. Not being an economist myself, I'm more on the democracy governance side of the problem. Other than sanctions being, implemented the way they've been implemented, what are those elements that kept Russian economy afloat? Someone say this, Nabibulina and others that are involved in this finance team of Russia, they did something right, in their view, right, obviously. So what, in your view, what was that they are still, other than, on their side, they did something right, of course, invertical marks? Thank you.
As I said, they were prepared because they knew that they will fight Ukraine, and they knew that there will be some consequences anyway. So the actions in the energy market made that the prices for gas, for example, increased sharply for several times, in 10 times sometimes. So the revenues of Russia's national budget increased also sharply, and the surplus of external trade was really in their favor. Also, they knew that they will need money, so they created a sovereign welfare fund. They have billions of dollars there, and they have the possibility to use if they are needed. So they used that money, and they invested inside Russia also. Because if the revenues are decreasing, how you're enforcing the economy? You're just giving the money to the investment. And that was seen during, for example, pandemic in different countries. In my country, the budget deficit increased sharply just because the previous government decided to spend on investment. And investment, that means roads, bridges, and everything inside the country. And it creates GDP, and that's why the economy performs quite well. Also, part of the economy is something that Russia is investing into the war-related issues, and it also creates GDP because you produce goods that are used in the war, but anyway, it's GDP. And also, during the first days, the monetary policy also worked quite well because they didn't allow rubles to go away from the country, and that they created that ruble didn't drop down, and the price of the ruble didn't fall down as much as we expected. So they're not stupid. They're acting like a normal government. They're trying to impose their decisions, and they're quite effective sometimes. But anyway, without our performance, the effect would be even lower.
Just before I go to the next question on a related note, one of the things that Putin presumably counted on was support from China and other non-aligned countries after going to war in Ukraine. And so that has proven to be the case. And many are now arguing that he's basically set in motion events that will basically make Russia an economic colony of China. But in the immediate term, there are other countries who are not aligned with the Western sanctions regime who are helping to prop up the Russian economy. So India and China's oil imports, for example. What role do you think the US has been reluctant to pressure those countries, for example, through secondary sanctions? What role do you think Europe and then maybe Lithuania, countries like Lithuania itself, can play as an intermediary with those countries to convince them that maybe supporting Russia isn't the best idea, if any?
I think it's a toughest question because if United States have secondary sanctions, Europe doesn't have one, and our impact is only on directly in European Union territory existing entities. So the implementation of the sanctions somewhere else is really an issue, and there is a bigger role of United States really to impact somebody who is outside. But we have a soft power also, and there's always discussions about additional possibilities for those countries or the people who are living in those countries. So I think that we're trying to use all the weapons that we have.
Sarah, I think back there you had a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead, and then I'll come to you next, sorry.
I am with Hudson Institute. Thank you so much for being here, Minister. You brought up that a lot of countries are kind of being a loophole for sanctions on Russia. How do you propose that we can prevent that from happening?
As I said, there is an issue just because if you're trying to impose something that are not acceptable for those countries, it's not so easy. But if United States have sanctions that could be implemented and related to the, for example, US dollar, Europe has different laws, and it's not very easy to have the sanctions outside European Union. So I think we have to use soft power because really there are possibilities that those countries really are interested in, and the cooperation with European Union, with other democratic countries, for them are really important also because it affects their economy as well. So I think we have to be creative and to find what's important to them, and maybe to discuss that whose friend is better. And if you want to be friends with Russia, maybe I'm not so good friend for you anymore.
Hi, I'm Raj. I have no affiliation. I have two questions. Well, if we look at the history of humankind, all wars ended at some point. So this too shall end. Are there any effective instruments to force Russia to pay for reparations in addition to using frozen Russian assets in other countries? That's one. And the other one is, I think I forgot my other question, sorry.
That's a good question, and it's a big one, so.
Yeah, I can ask now.
Yeah, sure.
Are there any long-term plans for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years from European Union to eliminate dependency on Russian oil, gas, energy, because, well, Putin may not be there after 10, 20, whatever number of years. Someone else may do what Russia is doing now. So would that be possible for European Union to not depend on Russia at all for critical resources?
I can start from the second one because it's really what I like in the current situation, because the current situation is not good. The war is happening, but what I like the Europe's decisions. And if Lithuania maybe knew Russia better than the others, and we made our decisions much earlier than the others, and we have our possibility to buy from whatever we want our energy goods. We have LNG terminal, we have interconnections with other countries, and it gives us a possibility to be free from Russian goods. But other European Union countries didn't have that, and they were very dependent on Russia, on Russia's fossil fuels. So now all the member states in Europe are telling that Lithuanians were right, and you always were right. You knew Russia very well. And now everybody understands that they have to follow the same decisions. And Europe made the package to Repower EU about new ambition, how to be independent continent, how to use renewable energy, because we do not have fossil fuels. But we have the possibility to invest into renewables and to have this strategic autonomy that is always the question. And previously we were autonomous maybe in many cases, but not on energy, and Russia used it very well. So I like the decisions that Europe are making. We have very ambitious plans to have the connections with other countries, also increasing the possibility to bring gas from the other countries. Countries are investing in LNG terminals, but what I like the most, the ambition to invest into renewables. For example, Lithuania until 2030 will be, at least in electricity, self-dependent, self-efficient country. We will produce all the electricity that is needed inside the country from the renewables. That means we will not depend on Russian fossil fuels anymore. And other countries are following the same example, and I think maybe not so fast as Lithuania, but other European countries are doing the same decisions and are investing hardly into independence. About reparations of the war, and if there is any other instrument to make Russia pay for the damages that they have done in Ukraine, I think it will depend on how the war will end. And if it will be total defeat, then you have like a system of reparations, and then they will pay like it was after the World War II. But I think in the current situation, knowing Russia and their ability to recognize that they lost, I think that our only possibility is to keep the frozen assets, because it's a lot. It's around 300 billion of Russian frozen central bank assets, and around 50 billion of oligarchs' money in different democratic countries. So for today is quite a lot, and I think it could be used to the reconstruction of Ukraine.
Any other questions? What Oh, sure. Go ahead, Marshall.
I think my affiliation is rather clear. Minister, could you talk a little bit about both the Ukrainian and Belarusian refugees that Lithuania has absorbed and is taking care of? As a finance minister, how is that going? How are you handling some of the financial dimensions to this? But more broadly, how is Lithuanian society handling an influx of such a large number of refugees?
I think very well, because previously maybe I had more more ideas how it can be evolved, but current situation is quite optimistic because we have seen that the number of Ukrainians that came in Lithuania is around 74,000 Ukrainians. Well, half of the adult people that came into the country, because there are a lot of kids. Half of the adults that came in Lithuania, they are already working, and it's the best result in European Union. I think partly is because of cultural things, and Lithuanian society is really supportive to Ukrainians, really supportive. You can see Ukrainian flags everywhere. Everybody supports Ukraine. Everybody wants to give their job and give them job and to have some, give something, do something to help them. So very supportive, and we're seeing that they're integrating into Lithuanian society very well. Some of them will come back home when their homes will be reconstructed, because some of them do not have homes anymore. In Ukraine, there are above 1,500,000 houses are affected or destroyed or partly destroyed. So a lot of people just do not where to go back. But I think when they have the possibility, they will go back. And the Belarusian minority also integrated very well, because it was like more like Belarusian youth who came out of the country. They didn't want to live under the regime of Lukashenko. They want to think freely, to speak freely. So the part of the society that came to Lithuania, I think it's a really bright people, and they're integrating very well. They're creating a high value added jobs in the capital city. And we're seeing especially IT specialists. I don't know why, but the really big part of the Belarusians that came to Lithuania is IT specialists. So they are integrating very well. They have jobs. They are supported by the society, and I think it's really important.
Any other questions? I have a sort of, I guess, as we're getting towards the end of our time here, Lithuania shares a border with the Russian enclave, Kaliningrad. You border Belarus. This stuff is all very much on your doorstep, and as we said, Lithuania has always been very on guard against Russian interference attempts and its revanchist ambitions. It's always been very aware of those. That was not the case for lots of other European countries who've had to sort of scramble to get their ducks in a row to be able to respond to this in an effective way. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not the only sort of potential international crisis on the horizon. China's been very clear that it will attempt to reunify Taiwan using force if necessary. One can foresee, should Iran get a nuclear bomb, a horrible conflict kicking off in the Middle East. Do you think Europe is in a good place as a result of, I wouldn't say a good place, it's a tragic, the whole thing is a tragedy. But has it, put Europe, given it a wake-up call in the sense that, we had, after the Cold War, sort of 20 years of globalization, and there were no sort of major conflicts around the world. There were many sort of conflicts, but nothing sort of existential as far as Europe was concerned. Has there been a sea change? Has there been a permanent change in Europe's, thinking? I mean, President Macron's talking about the push towards strategic autonomy. He really wants to push that now. But on a systemic level, we talked about some of the sort of intricate anti-money laundering, laws that you're passing and things like that. Is this stuff just going to be much more on Europeans' minds from now on, do you think?
I think it must be, because now we understand that we took many things for granted, because peace is not something that is really is for granted. You have to invest into it, and previously I think there was a wrong perception that economy is everything, and if economic-wise, the decisions will be made like you expect. Mm-hmm. And Russia's intentions, for example, but I think all the regimes are a bit similar. For example, Russia's intentions is to have more power, have more land, more power, to impose their decisions to other countries. Their intentions is not to earn more money. Mm-hmm. And if you understand that, you can understand all their decisions. And that, I think, was the wrong perception of the most of many European countries, big countries, for example, like Germany, like France. They thought that economy is everything. Economy is the least important thing for Russian authorities. They have their own intentions, and power is something that they seek to. And if you understand that your perception, what's important to your enemies, is wrong, you can understand what they seek to, you can understand that you can fight it with your own decisions as well. And if you invest into the democratic society where people will choose how they want to live, you can earn the safe society, the safe environment, the safe countries, landscape, the safe continents. And I think it's really important to understand that security and peace is nothing that goes for granted. You have to do something, and I think Europe understood that at last.
I guess sort of a final thought. Just if you had a message for people here in the US who are sort of a bit concerned about, the US's role in supporting Ukraine. Opinion polls here consistently show a majority of Americans, both Republicans and Democrats, support, ongoing US assistance for Ukraine, military hardware, training, and so on and so forth. They support the amount of the financial assistance we're providing for Ukraine. Unfortunately, some, sort of prominent leaders on both sort of far right and the far left are sort of increasingly trying to question that in very public fora. And it's sowing the sort of seeds of doubts, I guess, in some Americans' minds. Why are we sending so much money to a country on the other side of the world? Why are we, engaged in this battle of sanctions with and potentially antagonizing Putin, and who might escalate into a sort of a nuclear conflict or something? Why are we risking this? But as Marshall said at the start, as you've talked about, Lithuania, despite the economic cost to Lithuania of doing the right thing, is in the top 3 with your Baltic neighbors, countries that, as a percentage of your GDP, provide assistance to Ukraine. So you obviously think it's worthwhile to do. Do you have a message for Americans who are starting to wonder, why is it worth it to us? We're on the other side of the world. We're a superpower. We can take care of ourselves. Why should we get dragged into endlessly sending money over, sending weapons over, potentially antagonizing other world powers? What would your message be to them?
We're not living in an isolated space. You cannot have some of the glass ceiling on the United States and think that you're living alone. We're living in a world that everybody affects each other. And if Ukraine now is fighting the war, I think they're fighting our war. They're stopping Russians there. And if they will lose and not stop Russians there, Russians will increase their ambitions and to impose their idea of living for other countries. Because previously we have seen that Russia is not stopping. They have Crimea in 2014. Previously it was Sakartvelo, Georgia in Europe, then Chechnya in Europe. They're expanding. And if you're not stopping them somewhere, and if Ukrainians want to fight this war and to fight it till the end, we must help them to stop them there. And if we wanna live in a democratic society, where you can speak freely, where you have a rules-based order, and you have to invest in it. And I think it's better to invest in something in the war, which is now there, than to wait for them to come to your country.
Well, thank you so much. I think we've come pretty much bang on to the end of our time here. Really fascinated, really inspired to hear about the work you're doing in Lithuania and in the European Union. Long may it continue. We're very grateful, certainly here at Hudson Institute, but I think, the United States as a whole. Despite the silly accent, I am a US citizen as well, so I can speak for both. And we're very grateful for your time today. Thank you for your insights, and it was great to have you.
Thank you.